Hello once again, everyone, and welcome back to our newest episode of So What, and today we're going to be covering Messer. Now, Messer is one of those that is near and dear to my heart, and also a bit of a strange one. So the last couple things that we covered were two systems of longsword, and if you watched the KDF one, you heard me mention that it branches out into other weapons, as does the Flower of Battle, but more so you're going to have a bit more other people contributing, let's say, with the same weapon, much like other people contributed to the longsword section, versus Fiore's one guy, right? So, on that note, the Messer basically is going to be in two main flavors. You kind of have pre-Lecküchner and post-Lecküchner. Now, as a note for that, Messer kind of takes off the mid-1400s and becomes the very popular sidearm slash just, general kind of day carry in the HRE. You'll see noblemen carrying these and they'll be ornately decorated. You'll see peasants carrying these and they'll be sometimes also very well decorated. You'll see them carry them in the day, you'll see them carry them as defense, you'll see them carry them in war. More often than not though, this is not necessarily a knightly sidearm, this is more of just a popular thing. So really, it kind of takes the place of sword and buckler and even melds with sword and buckler, as sometimes you will see specifically people are fighting with the buckler, but they have a messer in the other hand, whereas earlier they would have had an arming sword, or even in some other places they would have an arming sword at that time. But the biggest thing about Messer is going to be what source you're studying, as most Messer sections you're going to find are relatively short, relatively small, and tend to comprise only a couple actions, with some outliers once we get there. But for starting off with, let's talk a little bit about the basic properties that kind of give Messer its main thing. Now, first and foremost, when you look at my Messer especially, you might assume that this is a very cut-oriented system. But more often than not, it isn't. I like to think of it in this way. The majority of my actions are going to be relatively straight line, with me exploiting a couple different winding angles. So for example, he cuts in, I'm going to intercept using my flat, try to wind this, he pushes it, I'll wind to the other side. It's only when I'm really, really got him driven out of the middle line that I take that big tempo for a cut, or alternatively a wrestling action, oftentimes. I tend to think of those as kind of similar. The times that I would cut, or the times that I would wrestle, are the same kind of stimulus, it's just a question of distance, right? Versus other times, I really should be thinking with the point and trying to seek openings or drive him offline. Now, depending upon which of the initial systems you're looking at, there will be either a lot of actions or very few actions. So, kind of one of the first couple we get is going to be Paul's Call, and he, along with many other systems like Hans Talhofer, Parenfund, and others, don't really give us a lot. In fact, they don't even sometimes give us guard names. They just go, for example, this is a position, and then this is a position, right? All very simple, and in fact, those three are the exact same guards as dagger. So, might even be some kind of linkage there. But if you're not worried about writing a whole treatise on it, then just covering the basics is pretty good. You've got sword up high, point forward on your dominant side, point back, either you're pulling that from the scabbard or you're just starting low to use that back side. So, from here, we're going to get some very basic actions, and most tend to kind of follow this sort of flavor. So usually the very first play is going to be cut is coming from below, and we are going to have our sword held low, right? He comes in with that cut down. I'm either going to just knock the sword to the side or take his hand. Either way is fine. Or sometimes that one will also turn into covering and turning into the arm wrap with my hand, right? Very simplistic actions, very easy to do either out of the draw or just from this initial position. You just kind of go from where you go, right? Now a big thing, of course, with Messer is going to be the use of the offhand, of which we are given the following advice. Keep it on your back if you're fighting at distance, on your stomach if you seek to grapple, right? Most times I just keep it on my hip. That's just habit, as do most of my guys, but absolutely you can do one or the other. Doesn't particularly matter. Just be aware that you may have to travel a little bit further if you wish to grapple. But all in all, like I said, most initial actions are going to be just something simple like that, cutting the hand and getting out of the way, entering into a bind to wrap the arm or even take the sword, things along those lines, and the counteractions from then in. But the biggest thing that kind of makes Messer is that use of the noggle, right? So a very big concept that you're going to see implemented is the idea of flat versus edge. So if Nye and I bind edge on edge, right, Obviously with blunts, doesn't do anything, right? But with a sharp, this gives us a lot more tactile feedback, and they would slightly stick together. Not like stick, but they will stick a little bit together. And as such, if we end up here, if I try to do anything, Nye is going to feel it and respond to it a lot sooner. Versus, edge on flat, I can slide and it doesn't necessarily feel correct to him, right? And with sharps, it feels almost, I call it glossy, is how it kind of feels. So more often than not, what you'll find is the idea of denying someone your edge by putting your flat. So for example, if he cuts at me, rather than me catching with the edge which stops it, instead he cuts at me, and I will use the flat slide off to set up momentum, or things along those lines. But the biggest one is implementing it with the noggle. So the noggle, or nail, is that little outcropping on my right knuckle. And all that allows me to do is, now I've got kind of an extra plane of binding. I've got a three-pointed crossguard. So he cuts at me, I put my flat out there, which now it just puts him onto my noggle. He can't stop that point from going at him. Even if he hits the blade and tries to intercept, he either gives me momentum for my cut, or he slides down to my nail where I've got him trapped. And a lot of basic actions will work off of that. Another common thing that you will see at this time, kind of pre-Lecküchner, is going to be the idea of cutting the lead hand out of the bind. So for example, we both come to bind against each other, right? He kind of tries to wind and thrust at me around. That way works, but other way is really what I meant, right? He comes from there, stepping out and cutting the lead arm or things along those lines. Also pommel hooks and things like that. So we come into bind, right? Bringing my hook across to get control, things like that. So relatively simple. But then things really change. Around kind of late 1470s, I think it's exactly 1478, I could be wrong, but either way, around late 1470s, up comes the priest Lecküchner. Now Johannes Lecküchner has kind of a weird relationship with the KDF. His recital for Messerfechten is very similar to the Liechtenauer tradition. They're not necessarily linked, but it is a theory that they may have, that it's kind of been adopted, as it were. We don't know about, the influence between one versus the other, which came first, the chicken or the egg. We don't know. But what's the biggest difference is that, one, a lot of concepts are going to be, while they're similar, they're going to be specifically applied to the Messer. It's not just I'm taking longsword plays and doing it with the Messer. It's I'm taking the philosophy and applying it to Messer fighting. And also the guard names and the strike names are going to change. So some old familiars, right? Normally we call this Vom Tag. This is now Lugisland, the watchtower. Normally this would be ox, this is now Stier, right? Steer. Normally this would be plow, this is now Ebbe, the boar. And normally this would be Alber, the fool, but instead now it's become Bastei, the bastion. Or as I like to think of it, fortification, fortification, animal, animal, right? Very simple. The strikes, meanwhile, are going to be similar but not quite. And one theory that I've heard for the namings of these is that they're meant to be puns, almost, right? So a good example of this would be, if he goes up into Lugisland, of course it's Vom Tag. What's the counter Vom Tag? It's going to be the Zwerkau, right? But rather than being Zwerkau, now it's the Entrustau, right? Now some people interpret this as danger stroke or things along the line. The interpretation I've heard is that it means storm, right? The idea being, there's a fortification. What do you do to the fortification? You storm it, right? Things like that, right? The constrainer, the Zvinge, things like that, which is basically your Schildhau. You are wrapping up the bull, you're preventing it from coming at you, not bull, boar, you're preventing it from coming at you, things like that. It ends up with a bunch of puns and analogies. That's a really great way to remember things. But that's just one theory I've heard. You can look into it more if you like. But either way, point being, if you've done the KDF, Lecküchner is going to seem quite similar to you when you get to the strikes. So for example, we've got all your basics, right? Lugisland, we have the Entrustau, like I said, which is just going to basically be your Zwerkau. More often than not, you're going to be throwing it out of this sort of low position. Go ahead, approach in, step to get him going at me. And if he cuts at me, I constrain it, it's no big deal, right? You'll also see this used with various feints. So one of my personal favorites is to come up, cut, then come around and cut at the head, and things like that. And of course, it being like a Zwerkau, it leads into Zwerkau-like actions. Another example would be if he's down in Bastei, of course, we've got the Scheitelhau, but now it's going to be the Gewehrhau, right? I'm going to just step out and cut from the very, very top, forcing him to have to come up and deal with me, which if he tries to do so, I've got that point which I can dip underneath and do other fun things. Against Stier, we have the Wecke, And Wecker is one of my favorite. It means awakener, quite literally, and it's also modern German for alarm clock, which always makes me laugh. But the idea there being, right, if I cut the awakener at him, it's not going to stay there. It's going to transition across to the other side. So I am binding hard upon his flat to turn over and then turn it into his face, things like that. And you'll see a lot of that, the idea of, as we're fighting in the middle here, I'm going to suppress to open up a line to hit him. And this feels very different if you're looking at this like a choppy weapon, but the more you think of it in regards to fighting for the center line and always seeking the next 4 openings in the best binding way you can, and then getting them to be driven offline, turn that in either to a cut or a wrestling action, you have a lot of fun stuff. Now, of course, there's also some weird things in Messer, which is great, right? You will find actions, for example, the one that everyone loves comes mostly out of the Entrustau, right? I strike a blow here, I follow with my second Entrustau, which could be an Entrustau, it could be a half sword, I could come over to the half sword and then Mordschlag him 3 times. You get a bunch of just kind of funny stuff like that. You get a lot of wrestling actions, some of which are meant to be humorous. For example, there's a great play in which you throw someone onto the ground and you are instructed to then roll a 7 or 8, and the depiction has him laying on top of this other guy. We can actually show this, hit the deck. So basically, he gets him down and has kind of entwined his arms and his neck, and he's just pretty much sitting here and he's playing backgammon with a buddy, right? Because he can't get away. So a little bit of groundwork. There's one where you pitch the guy into the burlap sack that, of course, your 2 friends were standing there holding. Just humorous things, because this was also, of course, fought for just pure academic fun. Just like Sword and Buckler, when we eventually get around to that, I'll be talking more about it. You'll also sometimes find instances where you're supposed to, quote, strike him with the spine of the weapon, or the flat, so he feels it well, things along those lines. And there's also quite a few lockups. Kind of the famous one that everyone sort of sees is going to be, if he cuts at me, I'm going to wrap the arm, and I'm going to insert the blade through. So I've got his arm controlled, and of course his neck at the same time, and you can then throw him from there or what have you. That's the infamous one, and you'll probably see it represented quite a few times. But post Lecküchner, like I said, it kind of gets adopted by the KDF and becomes pretty much inseparable from all Messer sections that come afterwards. Some are still small, but most all of them go, yeah, Lecküchner's got it right, we're just going to kind of adopt his stuff. And he kind of revolutionizes Messer fighting, which is really cool to see, because most times when it comes to a tradition, we've got kind of the Grand Master, and then things spread out from there. In this case, we've got some examples before that becomes popular, and then the adoption of it afterwards, which is just a nice detail to see. You don't get it a whole lot. But like I said, that's pretty much going to be your basic overview of Messer. So summed up in a nutshell is going to be, it's much more fighty for the center, right? You're going to be using the noggle and the flat quite a bit to exploit new openings you don't normally get. You're going to be trying to drive them offline to either set up a cut or a throw or things along those lines. And in general, just, let the sword do the work. Don't try to force it. You will very quickly burn out your hand doing that. But either way, thank you very much, Nye. Next time, we will be going over Rapier, hopefully, is next on the list, and then probably tackling Sword and Buckler. But either way, hope this was helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll go over some other techniques another time.